Hi everyone. Today I'll be trying to address the question of why do we have front-end frameworks and libraries in the context of software development, right? So yeah, it's a pretty intuitive question that we get after seeing like the plethora of front-end libraries and frameworks we have. So I'll be specifically talking in terms of React. So to start with, let's just go pretty like at the start of the internet, somewhere around 1990s. Not exactly the start, but yeah. Back then we had something as like a static websites. So what that means is that we would have some sort of this configuration where there is like client and then server, and every time a client wanted to access some information, it would just like hit up a request to server, and then it would give it like a document file which is like an HTML, and then it goes back to client. But every time there has to be some changes to the content, the client would reach back to the server, and then it is ask for like a new file, and the new file is like given back to it. And you see like there is this roundabout which goes around, which is sort of pretty slow and bit bad for the user experience as well. But down the line someone sort of figured it out. For minor changes, client doesn't need to come back to server every time. We could just like prepackage some instructions along with the actual document, and then the client actually could run all those instructions on the client side itself, right? So that is where the JavaScript came from. So JavaScript is like sort of telling a way to tell the client to how to deal with the small changes. A good example of this would be like having a theme toggle at the website, right? Like if we just want to have a dark theme or a light theme, we'll just like toggle a button, and the content is exactly same. It's just the color of the page which changes. It doesn't make sense to go back to server for such small things. Now, this is how we get dynamic websites, and it is aesthetically pleasing. And then again, we could do like all sorts of things like animations and stuff with this sort of setting. But then you might ask, how do dynamic websites work and how they are represented and how they are different from this static website manner? So let's say we have some sort of like this document representation where like there is like a first H1 tag which is like hello world, and then there is the P tag paragraph tag list of names, and there is then an ordered list of name 1, name 2, name 3, and we want to store this thing in an accessible way inside a browser's memory. So that is where a document object models comes in. So what document object model is that it's just a way of storing the document inside the memory of the browser, and more specifically, it gets served as a tree. So this same thing would get saved like HTML, H1 tag, and then P, and then there is again an ordered list, and then there are children of the unordered list, and then the developer would write sets of instruction to tell the client on how to change the data. So for our example, let's just say we have a button on the web page where we want to change the first name to name 0 whenever the user clicks the button. So the code for that or the instructions for that would look something like document.query selector get the 0 tag, and then text content equals to name 0. And this is like a JavaScript instructions. The JavaScript would communicate the DOM API, and then the DOM API would change the in-memory browser representation, and then once it renders, it will look like this, right? So this is all nice, and this sort of gives us like a one more degree of freedom on the client side where we could have very pretty web pages and everything. But for a developer, it gets pretty annoying pretty soon, because you could see for this small representation we had like a small tree, but for most of the real life use cases we have this very complicated looking tree, and it gets even more worse because for a lot of cases, even though the nodes might look independent, they rely on the same set of data. And for our case, let's call this like a states or something. So an example of the state would be if you are playing a game, the score is an example of state. So let's say all of this node actually depends on the score, and every time you want to or intend to update a score, you basically need to go to the whole DOM tree and then need to figure out where all the dependencies are, and then independently write like this document query selectors or all sort of things to update the independent node, right? And as a developer, it is painful to just write this repetitive stuff again and again. And if you see this sort of pattern actually emerges a lot while you are doing the dynamic changes. So if you think, and also like this sort of way of doing stuff is called as imperative way, because you are explicitly telling each and every instruction. But if you see logically speaking, what we want to do is that we just want to like increment the score, and then we just want to have things change based on how they are structured, right? So if we just go, if you see, because this thing is repetitive, we could write another piece of abstract algorithm to figure out instructions which will need to run based on the state changes we want, and that is what React basically does, right? So rather than having to write all the explicit changes ourselves, we basically tell React to set a state or maybe update a set to score +1. Then React takes this declarative state in, and then it figures out like bunch of changes it needs to do to make the change happen. And now it looks pretty nice, and it sort of looks like magic how it is figuring out all the dynamic changes and everything. So let's just see how it works. So React has this ideology of virtual DOM. So it basically is what it sounds like. We have an actual DOM which is just an in-memory representation of the document, and then React creates its own representation which is virtual DOM, which is managed by React and then stored inside the JavaScript memory. What it is, it does a shadow copy of it, and every time we want to do something, we just tell React in a declarative manner that okay, I have these multiple states or maybe changes that I need to push, and I just tell React that it will do those changes in the virtual DOM copy of the DOM, and once it is done with all of the changes, it will compare those changes with the actual DOM and then figure out the most efficient way of changing it such that the performance is optimized, right? And once you make the changes to the DOM, you get like the final representation, and then it gets rendered, and you have the final render of the web page. And this actually helps a lot while developing, because then you don't need to take care of all the small things that might go wrong while making changes to the actual DOM. And in some way, this also optimizes for the performance, because then you are consolidating all the changes together and then updating. There is another better like an improvement on this, which is called as React Fibers, but that is like a outside of the scope. So yeah, I think this sort of would give an intuitive understanding of why we have front-end frameworks and libraries, because in software development we want to abstract stuff so that we can have like a better experience of developing and then experimenting and then like come up with new things, right? So yeah, that's it. Thank you.